The heat was a physical weight. It pressed down on the town of Redemption, silencing the dogs in the dust and baking the very hope out of the air. Under the unforgiving Texas sun, and the horizon shimmered, turning the distant mesas into phantom islands, floating on a sea of fire. Jake stood in the sliver of shade offered by the blacksmith's awning and the rhythmic clang of the hammer, a familiar grounding sound. It was the only sound that felt real in the oppressive stillness of midday. 20 years. 20 years he'd been running not from the law, but from the ghost of the lawman he used to be. He'd traded his U.S. Marshal's badge for the calloused hands of a ranch hand, his Colt peacemaker for a branding iron, and the pursuit of justice for the weary, honest ache of a day's hard labor. Here in Redemption, he was just Jake, a man with a quiet disposition and eyes that held the geography of a past he never spoke of. It was an anonymous peace, fragile and hard-won. Across the street, the Redemption Bank and Trust stood as a monument to the town's prosperity, its false front painted a proud, clean white. Judge Tiberius Blackwood, the town's founder and patriarchs, often said the bank was the heart of their community. Today, that heart was about to be ripped out. It began not with a thunderous charge, but with a chilling, unnatural precision. 5 riders materialized at the end of the main street. Their movements synchronized their dusters, hanging unnaturally still in the windless air. They didn't whoop or holler. They moved with the quiet confidence of wolves closing in on a fold. The townsfolk, lulled by the heat, barely registered their arrival until it was too late. 2 riders dismounted and took up positions at either end of the street, their rifles held with casual menace. 2 more strode directly toward the bank. The 5th, the leader, remained mounted on a powerful black stallion, a specter of calm authority in the center of the unfolding chaos. Jake's body went rigid. The ranch hand vanished, and the marshal, dormant for 2 decades, awoke with a jolt of ice in his veins. He saw the patterns, the disciplined formation. This wasn't a clumsy smash and grab by drunken cowpokes. This was planned. Military. The doors to the bank swung open. A moment later, a single sharp gunshot cracked the silence. It wasn't the chaotic boom of a robbery gone wrong. It was the flat, final sound of an execution. Screams finally erupted from the nearby general store. A woman dropped her basket of laundry, the white sheets billowing into the rust-colored dust. The town, once frozen in heat, was now frozen in fear. The 2 outlaws emerged from the bank, carrying heavy satchels. They moved without haste, their faces obscured by bandanas. They mounted their horses, their eyes scanning the street, daring anyone to be a hero. Jake remained in the shadows, his hand instinctively twitching, searching for the familiar weight of a pistol that hadn't rested on his hip in 20 years. He was unarmed, invisible, a ghost at a funeral. The leader, still mounted, guided his horse forward a few paces. He was a tall man, his posture radiating an unnerving grace. He reached into his duster and pulled out a small silver object that glinted in the sun. With a deliberate, almost theatrical gesture, he let it fall into the dust not 10 feet from where Jake stood watching. His head turned slightly, his gaze seeming to pierce the shadows of the blacksmith shop and find Jake's eyes. It was a look of cold, intimate knowledge. Then, with a quiet word to his men, he turned his horse, and the 5 riders galloped away. Their hoofbeats a fading drum roll that left behind a ringing, terrified silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The dust settled. Then the bank's doors creaked open, and Mr. Abernathy, the young teller, stumbled out, his face ashen, a dark stain spreading across his white shirt. He collapsed onto the boardwalk. Behind him, inside the cool darkness of the bank, lay the body of the manager, Elias Vance, a good man, with a wife and 2 young daughters. The townspeople began to emerge, their movements hesitant, and their voices a low murmur of shock and horror. Sheriff Miller, a man whose duties usually involved settling disputes over stray cattle, rushed toward the bank, his face pale and his movements clumsy. But Jake's eyes were fixed on the object in the dust. The silver thing. He walked forward, his boots stirring the dirt. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth, their focus on the carnage at the bank. He knelt, his joints protesting. His fingers closed around the object, and a cold dread deeper and more profound than the shock of the robbery washed over him. It was a locket, silver tarnished with age, its surface etched with the image of a soaring hawk. He didn't need to open it. He knew what he would find inside. His thumb, guided by a phantom memory, pressed the clasp. It sprang open, revealing two miniature faded portraits. A man with kind eyes and a woman with a gentle smile. The Carver family. The world around Jake dissolved. The heat, the dust, the cries of the wounded teller, it all faded into a roaring in his ears. He was no longer in Redemption in 1885. He was 20 years in the past, a young, ambitious U.S. Marshal standing in the smoking ruins of a homestead. He could smell the ash, see the charred timbers clawing at the sky, and feel the unbearable weight of his failure. The Carvers, their 2 children, all gone. The official report called it a tragic accident, a lantern knocked over in the barn. But Jake knew it was a lie. He had found track signs of a dozen men who had come and gone like ghosts. He had pursued the case with a feverish intensity, but every lead turned to smoke, every witness went silent. The investigation was stonewalled, sabotaged from within by forces he couldn't see. The failure had broken him, hollowing out his faith in the law and in himself. He resigned his commission, trading his badge for oblivion. And now, this locket, the very one he had seen in a family portrait in the Carvers' burned-out home, had been dropped at his feet by the leader of a gang of ruthless killers. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a summons. A ghost from the grave had reached across 2 decades to find him. The anonymous peace he had so carefully constructed was shattered. The past wasn't dead. It wasn't even past. It had just ridden into redemption. The day after the robbery, a funeral quiet settled over Redemption. The townsfolk spoke in whispers, their eyes darting nervously toward the empty street, as if expecting the 5 riders to reappear at any moment. Elias Vance was buried in the small cemetery on the hill, his wife's sobs a thin, sharp sound against the vast silence of the plains. Judge Blackwood delivered a powerful eulogy, his voice resonating with authority and sorrow. He spoke of resilience, of community, of the unshakable spirit of redemption. He promised that justice would be done, and his words were a balm to the terrified town. Jake listened from the back of the crowd, and the silver locket, a cold, heavy weight in his pocket. He watched the judge, a man who had built this town from nothing. Blackwood was handsome, silver-haired, his posture impeccable. He looked like every statue of a great statesman Jake had ever seen. He was the law here in a way that went far beyond Sheriff Miller's tin star. He owned the bank, the largest ranch, and the controlling interest in the silver mine that gave the town its lifeblood. His benevolence was the bedrock of Redemption's existence. After the funeral, Jake retreated to the small cabin he called home, on the outskirts of the Triple B Ranch, Blackwood's Ranch. His life was a study in Spartan routine. He rose before the sun, worked the cattle until his muscles screamed for rest, ate his meals alone, and fell into an exhausted sleep. The physical toil was a self-imposed penance, a way to keep the memories at bay. But now, the memories were awake, and they would not be silenced by sweat and exhaustion. He sat at his rough-hewn table, the locket open before him. The faces of John and Mary Carver stared up at him, their painted smiles a silent accusation. He had failed them. He had let their killers walk free. And the man who led the bank robbers, the man he now knew only as Silas knew it, He had dropped the locket as a challenge, a piece of a puzzle only Jake could solve. But why? Why now? The robbery itself was a contradiction. It was brutally efficient, yet strangely restrained. Aside from the cold-blooded murder of Vance, nothing else was touched. The gang ignored the safes in the back, taking only the cash from the teller drawers enough to make a statement, but far from the fortune they could have taken. And why kill the manager? Vance was a newcomer, a man with no enemies. It made no sense as a simple robbery. It was personal. It was a message. The old instincts buried for 2 decades began to stir. Jake felt the familiar pull of the hunt and the gnawing need to understand the why behind the what. He had to know who Silas was and what he wanted. He had to understand the connection between a 20-year-old massacre and a bloody bank robbery in a town that prided itself on peace. His first stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was a decent man, but he was out of his depth, and he knew it. He sat behind his desk, staring at a stack of paperwork as if it might offer up the answers he so desperately needed. Miller, Jake said, his voice rusty from disuse. The sheriff looked up, startled. Jake, what can I do for you? Jake closed the office door. He placed the locket on the desk. The leader of the gang dropped this. Miller picked it up, his brow furrowed. A locket. What's this got to do with anything? It belonged to a family that was murdered 20 years ago. The Carvers. I was the marshal on the case. The sheriff's eyes widened. He had heard the rumors about Jake's past, but like everyone else, he'd had the good sense not to ask. The Carvers never heard of them. Their homestead was about 30 miles north of here, burned to the ground. The land is part of Blackwood's North Pasture now. A flicker of understanding, quickly suppressed, crossed Miller's face. Look, Jake, I appreciate you bringing this in. But this is way beyond me. A federal crime, bank robbery murder. The U.S. Marshals will be sending someone down from Austin to take over the investigation. That's not the point, Jake pressed. This wasn't just a robbery. The man who dropped this knew I'd be here. He knew I'd recognize it. This is about the Carver case. Sheriff Miller sighed a weary bureaucratic sound. He pushed the locket back across the desk. Jake, I know you mean well, but you're not a lawman anymore. Let the professionals handle it. Stirring up old ghosts won't bring Elias Vance back. And frankly, it could cause a lot of trouble for this town. What kind of trouble? The kind that comes from digging where you're not supposed to. Miller set his gaze unwavering. Judge Blackwood has worked hard to build a peaceful community here. Let's not unravel it by pulling on threads from 20 years ago. Let it lie. It was a warning, plain and simple. Jake took the locket and left the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. Let it lie. It was the same advice he'd been giving himself for 2 decades. But now he couldn't. Silas wouldn't let him. The warning from the sheriff only solidified Jake's resolve. If the local law wanted him to stay quiet, it meant there was something to hide. He knew his next step would be more dangerous, a direct challenge to the unspoken authority that governed redemption. He needed to talk to Judge Blackwood. He found the judge in his study, a cavernous room lined with leather-bound books that smelled of dust and money. A large map of the county dominated one wall with the vast expanse of the Blackwood holdings marked out in bold ink. The judge sat behind a massive oak desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the very picture of civilized power. Jake Blackwood said, his voice smooth and welcoming, "I'm glad you came. A terrible business, this. Terrible. Please sit." Jake remained standing. "I need to ask you about the land your North Pasture is on." Blackwood's smile didn't falter, but a subtle tension entered his shoulders. The North Pasture, fine grazing land. Best in the county. What about it? Before you bought it, it belonged to a family named Carver. The judge took a slow sip of his whiskey. He set the glass down with a soft click. Ah, yes. The Carvers. A tragedy that was. A fire, as I recall. It was a long time ago. I bought the land from the state a year or so after. Why do you ask? The man who led the robbery, he left something behind. Jake set his voice flat. He placed the locket on the polished surface of the desk. Blackwood looked at it, but didn't touch it. His expression was one of mild curiosity. A locket. How strange. Does it have some significance? It belonged to Mary Carver. For the first time, a crack appeared in the judge's polished facade. His eyes, cold and intelligent, narrowed. You seem to know a great deal about this for a ranch hand. I was the marshal who investigated their deaths. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken history. Judge Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying Jake as if seeing him for the first time. The friendly benefactor was gone, replaced by a man of calculating intellect. I see, he said slowly. A past life. We all have them, I suppose. But the past is a dangerous country, Jake, full of ghosts and regrets. It's why I built Redemption to be a place where men could have a future, free from the shadows of what came before. Those shadows just rode into your town and killed your bank manager. A random act of violence by desperate men, Blackwood countered smoothly. They will be caught and they will be hanged. But to connect their savagery to a 2-decade-old tragedy, that seems a stretch of the imagination, wouldn't you say? The man who led them dropped this at my feet. That's not imagination, that's a fact. The judge stood and walked to the window, his back to Jake. He stared out at the town. He had built his town. Sheriff Miller is a good man, but this is beyond his capabilities. I have already sent a telegram to the governor requesting assistance from the Texas Rangers. They will handle this. In the meantime, he turned his face once again, composed a mask of paternal concern. I would advise you to let this matter rest. You are a good worker, Jake. You have a place here. Don't jeopardize that by chasing phantoms. Some things are best left buried for the good of Redemption. The threat was veiled in velvet, but it was as clear as the one from Sheriff Miller. Let it lie. Jake left the judge's mansion with a cold certainty growing in his gut. Blackwood knew more than he was letting on. The carefully constructed piece of Redemption was built on a foundation of secrets, and the Carver family was buried somewhere in that foundation. Silas hadn't just robbed a bank. He had lit a fuse, and Jake was standing right on top of it. He walked away not as a ranch hand seeking answers, but as a marshal reopening his coldest case. The hunt had begun. The town of Redemption had a short memory by design. Its official history, lovingly curated by Judge Blackwood, began the day he drove the first survey stake into the ground. Anything before that was relegated to the realm of myth and forgotten tragedy. To find the truth about the Carver land, Jake knew he couldn't rely on the town's living residents. He had to consult its dead. The county records were kept in a small, dusty office at the back of the courthouse, managed by a wizened clerk named Eustace, a man who seemed to have been filed away along with the old documents. Looking for something, Jake Eustace squinted at him over a pair of spectacles perched precariously on the end of his nose. Land deeds, Jake said, from around 1865. Eustace shuffled through a series of massive, leather-bound ledgers. That'd be in the old archive. Most folks are only interested in what's current. What parcel you looking for? The land north of town, the old Carver place. The clerk's hands paused. The Carver place hasn't been called that in 20 years. It's all Blackwood property now. Section 12, North Range. I need to see the original deed. And the transfer. With a sigh that seemed to stir the dust of ages, Eustace led Jake into a back room crammed with shelves of aging paper. It smelled of decay and forgotten stories. He pointed to a high shelf. Should be up there, if the silverfish haven't eaten it. It took Jake an hour of sifting through brittle documents, but he found it. The original homestead grant issued to John Carver in 1863. A neatly drawn map showed a modest plot of land bisected by a strong year-round creek, the only significant water source for miles. Water was life in this part of Texas. It was more valuable than gold. Then he found the transfer. It wasn't a sale. It was a forfeiture. After the deaths of the entire family, the land had reverted to the state due to unpaid taxes. A year later, it was sold at public auction. The sole bidder was a newly formed company, the Redemption Land and Development Corporation. The signature on the bottom of the document was elegant and bold, Tiberius Blackwood, President. It was all perfectly legal, perfectly clean, but it stank. A family with access to the best water in the region suddenly dies in a freak accident, and the most powerful man in the territory just happens to be there to scoop up the land for pennies on the dollar. It was a story as old as the West itself. As Jake was leaving the courthouse, a new sound drifted through the town, the rhythmic hammering of construction. A crew of men was repairing the bank's shattered doorframe. The town was patching over the wound, trying to forget. But Jake knew the infection was spreading beneath the surface. He needed more than old papers. He needed to see the land for himself. He saddled his horse and rode north, leaving the carefully ordered streets of Redemption behind. As he rode, he felt a strange sense of liberation. For 20 years he had tried to be someone else to suppress the man he was. Now that man was back in the saddle, the instincts sharp, the senses alive to the subtle language of the landscape. The Carver homestead was gone, as he knew it would be. All that remained were a few foundation stones, nearly swallowed by prairie grass, and a single gnarled oak tree that had somehow survived the fire. Blackwood's cattle grazed peacefully where the Carver's house had once stood. It was a picture of pastoral tranquility, a beautiful lie painted over a scene of slaughter. Jake dismounted and walked the grounds. He found the spot where the barn had been, the earth still darker, more compacted. He closed his eyes, letting the memory wash over him. The smell of smoke, the sight of the 4 canvas-wrapped bodies, the faces of the local deputies, eager to close the case, to call it an accident. He had been an outsider, a federal man, and they had closed ranks against him. His gaze fell upon the creek still running clear and strong. He walked to its edge and knelt, splashing the cool water on his face. This was the prize. This was what the Carvers had died for, and Blackwood had won it. As the sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across the land, Jake heard a distant rumble. It wasn't thunder. It was fire. He climbed a small rise and looked back toward the east, in the direction of Blackwood's mining operation. A thick plume of black smoke was rising into the twilight sky. Silas had struck again. Jake spurred his horse, riding hard toward the smoke. He arrived to a scene of controlled chaos. The main storehouse for the silver mine, a massive wooden structure filled with equipment and provisions, was engulfed in flames. Blackwood's men were attempting to form a bucket brigade from a nearby well, but it was a futile effort. The fire was too hot too fast. Judge Blackwood himself was there, mounted on his fine gray mare, his face a mask of cold fury as he watched his investment turn to ash. He saw Jake ride up, and his eyes glittered with suspicion. "This is your fault." Blackwood snarled, his voice low and venomous. "You and your digging. You've stirred him up." "He's not after the town," Jake set his eyes on the fire. "He's after you." "He is a mad dog, and he will be put down," Blackwood declared. He turned to his foreman. "Get a party of riders together. I want them to track this filth back to whatever hole they crawled out of." "They'll be long gone," Judge the foreman said grimly. "They move like ghosts." This attack confirmed it. Silas wasn't a random marauder. He was waging a targeted war against Judge Blackwood. The bank robbery was the opening salvo, a public announcement. The fire was the second act, an attack on Blackwood's wealth. Each move was calculated precise, designed to dismantle the judge's empire piece by piece. And each move was a message to Jake. See what he built on the bones of my family. Jake knew he couldn't wait for the Rangers or the U.S. Marshals. They would see only the crimes, not the cause. They would hunt Silas as a common outlaw. But Jake understood this was something far more complex. This was a reckoning 20 years in the making. He had to find Silas himself. He had to get to him before Blackwood's men or the law did. He had to hear the rest of the story from the man who had started it all. He turned his horse away from the fire and rode into the growing darkness, not toward the safety of town, but toward the wild broken canyons where a ghost was waiting for him. The canyons were a labyrinth of shadow and stone, a place where a man could disappear forever. For 3 days, Jake tracked Silas and his men, relying on the old skills he thought he'd forgotten. He found their trail faint but undeniable. A displaced rock, a broken branch, the cold ashes of a hidden campfire. They were skilled covering their tracks, with an expert's care, but Jake was relentless. He was no longer just following a trail of evidence. He was following the pull of a shared history. He found their camp nestled in a box canyon accessible only by a single narrow passage. It was a perfect defensive position. He left his horse tied in a grove of cottonwoods and made the final approach on foot, moving with the silence of a predator. He saw a single guard posted high on the canyon rim. He bypassed him easily, circling around to come at the camp from above. Below, 4 men were gathered around a small, smokeless fire. And there, standing slightly apart, staring into the flames, as if divining the future, was their leader. Silas. Even from a distance, he radiated an aura of intense, focused energy. Jake drew the peacemaker he had taken from the sheriff's office, its weight a comforting, familiar presence in his hand. He moved down the rock face, as silent as a falling stone. He was 20 feet from the camp when a twig snapped under his boot. Instantly, all 5 men were on their feet, guns drawn, fanning out with a discipline that confirmed Jake's suspicions. These were not common outlaws. "You can come out now, Marshal," a voice called, calm and resonant. It was Silas. He stood in the center of the clearing, his pistol held loosely at his side, his face now uncovered. He was younger than Jake had expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with intelligent eyes and a face that might have been handsome were it not for the hardness around his mouth. "I've been expecting you?" Jake stepped into the firelight, his own gun leveled. "I'm not a marshal anymore." Silas smiled, a thin, mirthless expression. "The badge doesn't make the man. I knew you'd come. You were always the persistent one." "Who are you?" Jake demanded, his voice rough. "You don't recognize me. I'm hurt," Silas said, his tone laced with a theatrical sorrow. "Then again, I was only a boy, and our house was very much on fire." The world tilted under Jake's feet. He stared at the man's face, searching for the ghost of a child's features. The dark eyes, the strong jaw. He saw it. A faint, half-remembered image of the boy from the Carver family portrait. Silas. Jake whispered the name, a realization, not a question. John and Mary Carver had 2 children, a daughter Sarah and a son Silas. The one and only Silas confirmed with a slight bow. The boy who was supposed to have perished in the flames with the rest of his family. I was hiding in the root cellar. I watched them do it. I watched them burn my world to the ground. Jake lowered his gun, the strength draining from his arm. The puzzle pieces crashed into place, forming a picture of unimaginable horror. Blackwood, he said. Tiberius Blackwood. Silas corrected him, savoring the name like a curse. He wasn't a judge then, just a man with ambition and a thirst for land. My father wouldn't sell. Our creek was the key to his empire, and my father stood in his way. So he hired a dozen gunslingers to remove the obstacle. Silas's men relaxed slightly, holstering their weapons, but their eyes never left Jake. I watched you, Marshal. Silas continued, his voice losing its mocking edge, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I saw you arrive the next day. I saw you walk through the ashes of my life. You were the only one who didn't believe the lie, the only one who looked for the truth. I followed your investigation for weeks, a ghost boy watching the only good man in a world of wolves. You got close. Too close. I failed, Jake said, the words tasting like ash. I let him get away with it. You didn't fail, Silas said, his voice sharp. You were betrayed. Your own people cut you off at the knees. They buried your reports, reassigned your witnesses, sent you on one wild goose chase after another, until you finally broke. Blackwood's money reached further than you could ever imagine. But I never forgot. I spent 20 years getting strong, getting smart. I found other men wronged by Blackwood and his kind, and I forged them into an army. And now I've come back to collect a debt. Here was the truth, more terrible than Jake could have imagined. He wasn't hunting an outlaw. He was facing a survivor, an avenger forged in the fires of a massacre he had been powerless to prevent. The line between law and justice, once so clear in his mind, had blurred into an unrecognizable gray. Why kill Vance? Jake asked, needing to understand the one piece that still felt wrong. He was an innocent man. A shadow of genuine regret crossed Silas's face. There are no innocent men in Blackwood's world, Marshal. Only accomplices. Vance was the man who laundered the judge's money, who falsified the books, who foreclosed on honest ranchers when the judge wanted their land. He was a pillar in a temple of corruption. His death was a message to all the others: your master cannot protect you. He stepped closer, his dark eyes boring into Jake's. I didn't bring you here to fight you, Marshal. I brought you here to make you a proposition. Blackwood is the disease. I am the cure. My methods are direct. But the justice I seek is the same justice you were denied 20 years ago. Help me tear him down. Help me finish what you started. Jake looked from the face of Silas Carver, a man consumed by a righteous and terrible vengeance, to the faces of his men, hard determined and loyal. He thought of Judge Blackwood, the pillar of the community, the man of false smiles and veiled threats. He was standing at a crossroads. One path led back to the lie of redemption, to a comfortable, empty life. The other led into the heart of a storm, a path of violence and retribution, but a path that might, after 20 long years, lead to some form of justice. I'm not your hired gun, Jake said slowly. I'm not asking you to be, Silas replied. I'm asking you to be the lawman you were always meant to be, the one who understands that some snakes can only be killed by cutting off their head. The weight of the past 20 years pressed down on Jake, but for the first time, it was not the weight of failure. It was the weight of a choice. He was no longer a ranch hand hiding from his past. He was a man who had just been handed the truth and with it a chance at redemption. Jake left the canyon with Silas's proposition hanging in the air. He hadn't given an answer, and Silas hadn't pushed for one. They both knew a decision of that magnitude couldn't be made in the heat of a moment. It had to be settled in a man's soul. As Jake rode back toward redemption, a war raged within him. Everything Silas had said rang with the brutal clarity of truth. Blackwood was a murderer, a thief who had built his paradise on the graves of an innocent family. And Silas was the consequence the bloody bill come due. But Jake had worn a badge. He had sworn an oath to uphold the law, not to become a vigilante. To side with Silas would be to abandon the last remnant of the man he once was. To side against him would be to protect the very monster he had failed to catch 20 years ago. He entered redemption under the cloak of darkness, stabling his horse, and slipping through the back alleys toward his cabin. He needed time to think, to sort through the wreckage of his beliefs. But time was a luxury he no longer had. As he neared his cabin, he sensed it. A stillness that was wrong. The air was too heavy, too watchful. He flattened himself against the wall of the neighboring building, his hand on his gun. Two shadows detached themselves from the darkness near his front door. He recognized the broad shoulders of the sheriff's deputy and another of Blackwood's ranch hands. A trap. He retreated silently, circling around to the back of his cabin. The window was dark. He eased it open and slipped inside. The small room was filled with the smell of stale tobacco and the sour scent of fear. He waited, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. He could hear their quiet murmurs from the front porch. They were waiting for him to walk through the door. He had to know why. He couldn't run without understanding what had changed. Creeping to the front of the cabin, he peered through a crack in the wall. He saw Sheriff Miller emerge from the shadows across the street, accompanied by two more armed men. They weren't just waiting to talk. This was a posse. Suddenly, the front door of the saloon swung open, spilling a rectangle of yellow light onto the street. A man stumbled out, his face flushed with drink. Heard the news, the man slurred to a friend. That quiet fella, Jake. Turns out he's in league with those robbers. They say he helped plan the whole thing. There's a wanted poster up and everything. $500. Jake's blood ran cold. Blackwood hadn't waited for him to choose a side. He had chosen one for him. Realizing Jake knew the truth, the judge had moved to neutralize him, to discredit him, to turn the entire town against him. He was being framed for Silas's crimes. The ranch hand, the quiet man, the ghost, that man was dead. In his place was Jake the fugitive. He knew he couldn't stay. He checked the old peacemaker 5 rounds. He had no supplies, no horse, only the clothes on his back and a truth that no one would believe. He slipped back out the window just as Sheriff Miller gave the signal to storm the cabin. "He's not in there," he heard the deputy shout a moment later. "Spread out," Miller commanded. "He can't have gone far. I want him found by sunrise, dead or alive." Jake moved through the shadows, a ghost in his own life. The town he had chosen for its anonymity had become a cage, and every citizen a potential enemy. He saw his own face staring back at him from a poster hastily nailed to the livery wall. Wanted Jake, for robbery and complicity in murder. Below the words was a crude sketch that was just accurate enough to be damning. He needed to get out of town, but his horse was at the livery, which was now crawling with armed men. He slipped into the blacksmith shop, the place where his new life had felt most real. The air still smelled of coal smoke and hot iron. In the corner, he saw what he was looking for. Thor, the massive draft horse the blacksmith used for heavy hauling. A slow, powerful beast that no one would ever suspect a fugitive of stealing. He found a spare saddle and bridle, his hands working with practiced efficiency in the dark. He led the giant horse out the back, his heart pounding with a rhythm that was equal parts fear and exhilaration. He was running again, but this time he wasn't running from himself. He was running toward a fight. Blackwood had made a fatal error. In trying to silence Jake, he had cornered him, and a cornered man has nothing left to lose. The judge had taken away his name, his home, and his fragile peace. He had forced Jake's hand, leaving him with only one path forward. He rode Thor into the plains, the lights of redemption shrinking behind him. He was an outlaw now, a wanted man. The law he had once served was hunting him. The town he had tried to protect wanted him dead. He had no allies, no resources, no badge to hide behind. All he had was the truth and a 20-year-old promise to the ghosts of the Carver family. He was no longer caught between two sides. He was on a side of his own, and his first stop would be the canyons to give Silas Carver his answer. The sky broke. A clap of thunder sharp as a rifle shot rattled the windows of Redemption's Grand Saloon. Rain followed, not the gentle spring shower the ranchers prayed for, but a violent, angry downpour that turned the dusty street into a river of mud. The storm was a mirror of the tempest that had consumed the town. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool, cheap whiskey, and fear. Silas Carver had made his final move. He and his 4 men had walked in an hour before sunset, as calm as if they were ordering a drink. Within minutes, they had control. Judge Blackwood, Sheriff Miller, and 24 of the town's most prominent citizens were now hostages, their lives hanging on the whims of a man they saw as a monster. But Jake saw him as something else. He saw him as the inevitable conclusion to a story Blackwood had started 20 years ago. From a rooftop across the street, huddled under a leaking tarp, Jake watched. He had returned to Redemption, not as a fugitive, but as a fulcrum. The whole conflict balanced on him. He had spent the last 2 days planning, gathering what few resources he could. He had found an unlikely ally in Eustace, the old records clerk, a man who valued truth more than he feared the judge. Eustace had provided him with a layout of the saloon, including the location of a hidden cellar entrance in the back alley. He had also found one other person in town who owed nothing to Blackwood, Nuna, the elderly Comanche woman who lived on the outskirts trading herbs for supplies. She had treated a wound for him once, and in her eyes he had seen a deep understanding of the injustices of the world. She had given him a small, powerful bow and 3 arrows, silent weapons for a silent entry. The storm intensified, lightning illuminating the saloon's windows in stark theatrical flashes. This was it, the final act. Jake slipped down from the rooftop into the muddy alley. He found the cellar door, a heavy wooden slab set flush with the ground. He pried it open and descended into the damp, musty darkness. He moved through crates of liquor and barrels of beer, guided by the faint sounds from the floorboards above. He found the stairs leading up to the back storeroom. He drew his bow, nocked an arrow, and slowly, silently opened the door a crack. He saw one of Silas's men guarding the back entrance, his attention focused on the main room. Jake drew the string back. The bow was stiff, powerful. He aimed his breath, held tight in his chest. The arrow flew a whisper of death in the noisy chaos of the storm. It struck the guard in the throat. He fell without a sound, a puppet with its strings cut. Jake slipped into the storeroom, ditching the bow and drawing his peacemaker. He crept to the swinging doors that led into the main bar. The scene inside was a tableau of tension. Silas stood near the grand fireplace, his pistol resting on the mantel. His men were positioned, strategically covering all angles. Judge Blackwood was seated at a poker table, his face pale but defiant. "This is madness," Silas Blackwood said, his voice straining to maintain its usual authority. "You'll hang for this." "I've been living on borrowed time for 20 years, Judge Silas replied, his voice calm, almost conversational. "A rope holds no fear for me. But you fear the truth more than any noose." He turned to the assembled hostages. This man, your benefactor, your founder, he is a fraud. He built this town on the blood of my family. He murdered my mother, my father, and my sister for the water that now feeds his cattle. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Lies, Blackwood roared, rising to his feet. The ravings of a common criminal. Is it? Silas said softly. And then he began to tell the story, every detail seared into his memory. He spoke of the night of the fire, the faces of the men, the sound of his mother's screams. As he spoke, Jake pushed through the swinging doors, his gun raised. He's telling the truth. All eyes turned to him. Silas nodded slowly, a look of grim understanding on his face. He had expected Jake. He had counted on him. Jake Sheriff Miller shouted his hand, inching toward his holstered pistol. Don't be a fool, surrender now. There's only one criminal in this room who needs to surrender. Sheriff Jake said, his eyes locked on Blackwood. And it isn't me. Blackwood saw his empire crumbling. His carefully crafted reputation was being destroyed in front of the very people whose respect gave him power. He became desperate. He lunged, grabbing the arm of the bank teller's young wife, pulling her in front of him as a human shield. You see, Blackwood screamed, his voice cracking. He's in league with this killer. They planned this together. He looked at Jake, his eyes wild with a cornered animal's fury. You should have stayed gone, Marshal. But you had to dig. You had to pull at the threads. He let out a harsh, triumphant laugh. You want to know the real truth? You never had a chance of solving that case. Not then. Not ever. Your investigation wasn't just stonewalled. It was sabotaged from the very beginning. By your own mentor. Jake froze. The name hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. Marshal Jennings. The man who had trained him, who had been like a father to him. Marshal Jennings, Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. A very practical man, Blackwood gloated, feeling he had regained control. He understood the value of progress. And the value of my money. He was on my payroll for years. He's the one who sent you on that fool's errand to the Mexican border while my men took care of the Carvers. He ensured your reports were lost, your evidence misplaced. He broke you, Jake. I just paid for the service. It was the final betrayal, a blow more devastating than any bullet. The foundation of Jake's entire life, his belief in the law and the brotherhood of the Marshals, shattered in an instant. In that moment of stunned silence, as Jake reeled from the revelation, Silas acted. He didn't fire at Blackwood, who was still shielded by the woman. He fired at the massive, ornate chandelier hanging directly above the poker table. The bullet struck the chain. The huge brass and crystal fixture, weighing hundreds of pounds, tore free from the ceiling. It crashed down onto the table, shattering it, forcing Blackwood to shove the woman aside to save himself. In that split second, Blackwood was exposed. A gunshot echoed the thunder outside. It wasn't Jake's. It was Sheriff Miller who, upon hearing Blackwood's confession, had finally chosen a side. His bullet struck Blackwood in the shoulder, spinning him around. Jake's own gun came up. His mind was a storm of grief and rage, but his hand was steady. He saw not the powerful judge, but the man who had ordered the murder of a family, the man who had destroyed his life and corrupted the memory of his mentor. He saw the source of 20 years of pain. He fired. The bullet struck true. Judge Tiberius Blackwood collapsed to the floor. The truth finally silenced, but not before it had set the whole town free. The standoff was over. The shootout had been brief, decisive, and final. Chaos erupted as Silas's men, their purpose fulfilled, began to back toward the door, disappearing into the storm as mysteriously as they had arrived. The gun smoke cleared slowly, mingling with the haze from the oil lamps. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, marking the first seconds of Redemption's new uncertain future. Judge Blackwood lay dead on the floor, his reign of secrets over. Silas was gone, vanished back into the night. The townspeople shocked into silence by the revelations, and the violence began to stir. They looked from Blackwood's body to Sheriff Miller, who stood with his smoking pistol, his face a mixture of horror and resolve. Then they looked at Jake. He was no longer the outcast, the framed fugitive. He was the man who had brought the truth to light. But Jake felt no triumph. The final betrayal, the knowledge that his mentor, Marshall Jennings, had been a paid conspirator, had hollowed him out completely. He walked over to Blackwood's body, not to confirm the death, but to look at the face of the man who had cost him everything. A deputy rushed in, his face pale. "Sheriff, we found one of them outside. He's gut shot. Bad." Jake knew who it would be. He followed the deputy out into the rain-swept alley. There, slumped against the saloon's muddy wall, was Silas Carver. A stray bullet from one of Blackwood's men had found him as he made his escape. His breathing was shallow, a dark stain spreading across his duster. Jake knelt beside him. The rain washed the mud from Silas's face, revealing the features of the boy he had failed to save. "Did you hear him?" Silas whispered, a bloody froth on his lips. He admitted it. Everyone heard. They heard Jake confirmed, his voice thick. A faint, tired smile touched Silas's mouth. 20 years. It was a long road home. His eyes searched Jake's face. You finally brought the law, Marshal." "No," Jake said, the words catching in his throat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tarnished silver locket. He pressed it into Silas's hand. "I brought justice." Silas's fingers closed around the locket, a final connection to the family he had lost and fought so hard to avenge. He looked at the locket, then back at Jake. The fire in his eyes, the burning flame of vengeance that had driven him for 2 decades, finally flickered and went out. He had found no peace in his revenge, only the end of his pain. His head fell back against the wall, and he was still. Jake stayed there for a long moment, the rain washing over them both. He had brought justice, but at a terrible cost. The town of Redemption was free from its tyrant, but its innocence was shattered. Its history was a lie, its prosperity built on a crime. The falling action of their lives was just beginning. In the days that followed, Redemption was a town adrift. The shock of Judge Blackwood's confession and death left a power vacuum that no one knew how to fill. The townspeople had to reckon with the fact that their comfortable lives had been paid for with blood. Sheriff Miller, humbled and aged by the ordeal, began the slow, painful process of sorting through the legal and financial wreckage of Blackwood's empire, finding evidence of dozens of other smaller crimes and coercions. The bodies were buried. Blackwood was laid to rest in the cemetery he had founded, his gravestone large and ornate, yet visited by no one. Silas Carver was buried in a simple pine box in an unmarked grave at the edge of town. A quiet end for a man whose life had been defined by noise and fire. Jake had insisted on it, a final act of respect for the boy who had never had a chance to become a man. Jake was a hero, a pariah, and a ghost all at once. The wanted posters were torn down, but the townspeople didn't know how to look at him. He was a living reminder of their collective guilt, the man who had pulled back the curtain and revealed the ugly truth. He stayed only as long as he was needed, giving a full deposition to a U.S. Marshal sent from Austin, a young, earnest man who looked at Jake with a mixture of awe and pity. Jake told him everything, leaving out nothing, including the damning confession about Marshall Jennings. He knew it would send shockwaves through the service, but the truth had to be told. His work done, Jake knew he couldn't stay. Redemption was not his home. It was just a place he had passed through, a place where he had finally confronted the ghosts of his past. On his last day, he rode north one final time out to the forgotten spot where the Carver homestead had been. The foundation stones were almost invisible now, but he found them. There were no graves, no markers. The family had been consumed by the fire. He walked to the gnarled oak tree that stood as the plot's only sentinel. From his saddlebag, he pulled his old U.S. Marshal badge. It was tarnished and dull, the star points blunted with age and neglect. For 20 years, it had been a symbol of his failure, a heavy secret he carried with him everywhere. He took a cloth and slowly, deliberately polished it. He rubbed away the grime of 2 decades until the silver began to gleam in the afternoon sun. He saw his own reflection in it, the face of an older, wearier man, but a man whose eyes were finally clear. He didn't pin it back on his chest. He reached up and pressed the badge firmly into the bark of the old oak tree, embedding it there like a new star in a wooden sky. It was a gravestone for the Carvers. It was a final salute to the lawman he had been. And it was a release for the man he was now. He had forgiven himself. He mounted his horse and turned away, without a backward glance. He didn't know where he was going, and for the first time in his life, that felt like freedom. He rode toward the setting sun, a lone figure moving across the vast, empty plains, leaving the town of Redemption to find its own way. Back in town, as dusk settled, the young deputy who had stood by Sheriff Miller through the whole ordeal walked into the now quiet sheriff's office. Miller was at his desk, staring into a cup of cold coffee. "I'm resigning, son." Miller said, his voice heavy. "This town needs a lawman who can start fresh, someone who wasn't part of the lie." He slid his tin star across the desk. "It needs you." The deputy, a boy no older than Silas had been when his life was destroyed, looked at the badge. He was scared, but he was honest. He slowly reached out his fingers, closing around the simple star. He stood up straight, his shoulders squared, and pinned it to his shirt. A new law had come to Redemption.